As a leading provider of P&I cover and other services to the international shipping community, the club insures over 240 million tonnes of owned and chartered ships. This includes some of the world's largest and most sophisticated designs. We are championing best industry practice and investing in innovation. The UK P&I Club will continue to focus on what it does best: protecting shipping globally, together.
I am Nicholas Bornodis, President of Capital Link, and I would like to welcome you to today's podcast in the series Riding the Waves of a Lifetime. This podcast series gives us the opportunity to interact and discuss with the maritime industry leaders who share with us their career and life experiences, as well as their insight into the industry's direction, opportunities, challenges, and risks. So it's a trip down memory lane, and it's a look forward for the industry. I would like to thank the UK P&I Club and Thomas Miller for sponsoring today's podcast. And today we have the opportunity to discuss with one of the most important, accomplished, and versatile personalities in global shipping. Esben Poulsson has been rightly named shipping's busiest man, and you will see why. He has also been called shipping's nicest man. And we are privileged to host this podcast almost to the date when Esben began his maritime career in August, actually on August 31st, 1971. And again, thank you again to the UK P&I Club for sponsoring today's podcast. To his many accolades and endeavors, Esben has managed to add that of author. Esben published an autobiography called A Life in Shipping, which gives an extraordinary journey of the development of global shipping over the last 45 plus years. It talks about the emergence of Asia. It highlights all the colorful and larger than life personalities involved. It is an amazing book, extremely well written and very interesting, full of facts and history. It's like reading a book about the history of shipping. And I have to admit, I read it twice. By the way, the proceeds of that book go to the Mission of Seafarers, of which Esben is the vice president. So for those interested to buy this unique book, please contact us at webinars@capitallink.com, and we will give you the instructions how to buy the book. Now, let me go back to introducing briefly Esben. And I will borrow from his book. So I will read a small passage from the book. As you will see, he is truly a citizen of the world. He was born in Denmark, came of age and entered the maritime industry in Vancouver, moved to Hong Kong as a shipbroker, spent 2 years in the Philippines, relocated to London and Copenhagen, and then moved back to the East, this time to Singapore, where he has worked and resided since 2004. He is the executive chairman of Enesel Pte Ltd, a Singapore-based ship-owning entity that owns and operates a fleet of large container vessels, all under the Singapore flag. He is also a director on several corporate boards in Singapore, Hong Kong, Genoa. He is truly a citizen of the world. Adding to these, Esben has a larger role and footprint in the industry. Since 2016, he serves as the chairman of the International Chamber of Shipping, the global trade association that represents ship owners and operators with the various intergovernmental bodies that regulate shipping. He is now in his third term. So Esben also has been the president of the Singapore Shipping Association, and he is an advisory board member of the Singapore Maritime Foundation. By the way, I'd like to mention that the ICS represents over 80% of the global merchant fleet. Before I conclude the introduction, let me also mention Esben's athletic achievements, which are not behind those in business. He has been a competitive rower, an award-winning sailor, actually He's been involved in yacht racing, and he has a real passion for yacht racing, and he is a marathoner. So obviously, Esben is a highly accomplished person, having achieved distinct business success. But in my opinion, what makes Esben quite unique is the combination of this business success with three other factors. Number one, his sense of statesmanship. As I mentioned, Esben has a larger industry footprint, has a major institutional role and impact on the industry, and works tirelessly at it. Second, his humanity and commitment to give back to the community, supporting several charities. And third, and most important in my humble opinion, his sense of humility. Esben is not arrogant. He's very approachable. He's always open to ideas and suggestions, always ready to help. This is a unique combination of accolades. And with this, I would like to take the opportunity to welcome him. So Esben, please join us. And I'd like to take also the opportunity to thank him for the excellent cooperation and relationship we have developed over the years. So thank you for joining us today for this podcast. Now, this podcast will be, as I mentioned, a trip down memory lane, but also it will be a look forward given your overall role in the industry. So Esben, thank you for joining us. Let's start our discussion. And I will start a little bit with the traditional question, how did you get into shipping? Now, I read in your book the impact that your stepfather had in terms of your decision to get involved in shipping. But I also read that your great-great-grandfather has been a ship owner, Soren Anton Poulsson. And not only a ship owner, but he also started the school P&I club. So to speak, shipping must have been in your blood, in your genes. So tell us how it all happened. And welcome.
Nicholas, first of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me here. And thank you very much for your extremely generous words. I think I'm definitely blushing after that introduction. And I can't help but just quickly tell a little story of, Churchill had many great sayings or many great sort of one-liners. And one of them, which was on one of his, he was told that one of his opponents was a very modest fellow. And Churchill looked at it and said, yes, that's true. He has much to be modest about. So that was a little one. But to go to the question, Nicholas, I as you also mentioned in the book, my stepfather, who married my mother when I was 12 years old, had a very strong hand in my involvement in shipping because he introduced me to sailing, and we bonded through sailing. And when I was about 15, he said to me, you love the sea and you probably have some idea about business and you're going to be in shipping. He was a very firm man. And so he set about arranging a number of programs, including joining a German cargo ships from the west coast of Canada to Australia in the summer of 1966, the year when England won the World Cup. And we were listening to this very thing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on a crackly radio and an all German crew. You can imagine the reaction. But anyway, that was sort of the background. As far as the Anton Poulsson is concerned, indeed, he did found the school P&I club, the first non-British P&I club, actually. And he was given an honorary knighthood by the British, so the family always used to apparently call him Sir Anton. But funnily enough, all my other forefathers, including my own biological father and my grandfather, etc., were architects. They are Norwegian architects. And in fact, my grandfather, Magnus Poulsson, designed City Hall or co-designed City Hall in Oslo together with Arnstein Arneberg. So I'm actually the first in several generations, as far as I'm aware, to have entered this business.
Well, very well done. What can I say? And again, part of the amazing story you put in your book is also the photographic, all the photographs that you shared, which I find amazing. It's really, when you look at the whole timeline, it's amazing that you found all those pictures and you kept them and you put them in your book. Anyway, let's go now to August 31st, 1971. Now, this is the official beginning of your maritime career. You arrive in Hong Kong to begin working as a shipbroker for Wallen. So over the last 50 years, we have witnessed and experienced firsthand the rise of Asia as a maritime power and the transformation of global shipping. So your career has taken you to key industry centers, as I mentioned, in Europe and Asia. Would you like to share with us a couple of geopolitical and industry developments during that time that you rank among the most important?
Yeah, I think that's actually in this time frame. I think the two that really stand out would be China. China, when I arrived in Hong Kong, was a totally closed country. You could only enter it with a government invitation. There was no other way to go to China. And Hong Kong had, of course, been affected by the riots of 1967 during the Let All the Flowers Bloom or the Great Leap Forward, some of Mao's what turned out to be very misguided initiatives. And so China was a closed country, and you know, their acquisition of ships, they were very worried about their shipping needs because the Chinese flag was extremely restricted, including, by the way, even to the US. So they were beginning to buy ships through so-called Hong Kong front companies, Yik Fung, Ocean Tramping, Q-Lee, and so forth. And that's a chapter in itself. But upon Mao's death, after Nixon's visit and Mao's increasing frailty, he passed away in 1976, and that really was the rise of Deng Xiaoping, who then in the late 70s, early 80s came and stood on the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong and said one country, two systems. And he was, although he had no titles per se, he was a modern day emperor. And Deng Xiaoping unleashed what was to be the beginning of the China that we see today. So I think not only in maritime terms, but in global, you know, in global terms, political, economic, diplomatic, everything, that is a big one. The other one that I think stands out was the breakup of the Russian USSR in 1991. The breakup of that empire, if you call it that, because again, that was a very controlled economy when it was under pure communism. I so well remember that the bulk market in the 80s particularly was very much reliant on the Soviet grain imports. You know, that really was a big driver in the dry bulk market. You hardly hear about that these days, but at that time that was really a big one. There are other subplots like the Vietnam War, where eventually the North, of course, overran the South in the spring of 1975. I think the reason I mentioned that was because the domino theory, which was very prevalent in the US at that time, where the idea was that if one country in Asia goes communist, others will follow like dominoes. That theory, of course, in the event was totally discredited. But certainly the Vietnam War had many, many implications. And certainly if you look at Vietnam today, you only have to see what they've achieved subsequently in those years.
Very interesting. And Esben, you've been in this business for over 50 years. So you've seen so many things, you have experienced so many changes, you move back and forth, you know, in key industry centers. Would you like to focus on your career, share with us 2 or 3 instances that you consider as milestones in your career development?
Yeah, I think, and I've said this before, so for anybody who've heard this story already, my apologies, but the final deal in which I was involved as a shipbroker in 1996 was the sale of 2 VLCCs to Eastern Mediterranean, Thanasis Martinos. And what was so amazing about that was, and this is also related in the book, is that the very first ship I ever sold in 1971 was a little 1950 built log carrier called the Sunny Ocean, which was bought by Thanasis's mother, Mrs. Nunu Martinos, when Thanasis and his brothers Andreas and Dinos were, of course, young men. In fact, they were, I think, even younger than me at that time. So it's kind of ironic that you know, that was the first one and the last one. And in between, by the way, this family created 3 and even more now, but 3 significant companies, Eastern Mediterranean, Thanamaras, and Minerva. This is all in the space of 50 years. I think truly remarkable achievement, actually. That was one. Establishing the offshore supply boat business for TORM when I moved to London in 96, 97. That was an uphill battle that I finally succeeded in doing. And although it didn't become a big business, it became quite profitable. And in fact, one year, I think we were responsible for close to 50% of TORM's profits, although their profits were fairly modest at the time. But that was a 5-6 year project that I was very proud of. We finally sold the ships when strategically TORM decided to focus on product tankers and dry bulk only. And then I think the last one, which was more of a huge and pleasant surprise, was when in August of 2019, the president of Singapore awarded me the Public Service Star. And I mention it because it was just so unexpected. It's just something I never expected to happen. It's a fairly reasonably high-ranking medal in the Singapore system. And so that was it was particularly noteworthy because it was such a surprise.
Well, it was a surprise probably, but a very well-earned, I think, distinction, because not only you have worked tirelessly for the industry, but you've also done a lot for Singapore. And over the years, I think Singapore has risen to become the major global center it is. And you're part of that process. So, and that is a very nice way to start our discussion now, Esben, about the industry. Frankly, you have this wonderful book that describes your career throughout the years. I'd like to benefit from having you with us to talk about looking forward, looking today and forward, and be able to share into your unique insight into the industry. So you've been the chairman of ICS since 2016. You are in your 3rd term. I think that's proof enough of the great work you do, because people renew your tenure every 2 years. So in your interview, in other interviews in the past, you have mentioned that a number of owners do not exactly comprehend the value that these associations bring to the industry and the great benefits and results that you generate. So, but you also mentioned that COVID now has fostered better and bigger cooperation among all these organizations. So let me ask you, you have the 4 major organizations, ICS, BIMCO, Intertarco, and Intercargo, and the 4 of you are the Roundtable. You also have the World Shipping Council. So how do you all work together? Are you pursuing similar objectives? Do you coordinate? How do you promote the industry as a whole?
Well, I think we have to just differentiate. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that ICS is a membership organization. In other words, it's member of members. I mean, let me explain it properly. Our members are associations. So Denmark, Norway, Greece, Japan, about 38 national associations are our members, and a further 11 niche associations are our associate members. So we are dealing with associations. So the secretariats of all these associations are the ones that we typically deal with, whereas BIMCO, Intertanko, and Intercargo are what we call direct member organizations. The latter 2, of course, specific to those 2 segments, and BIMCO traditionally very much documentary, but have since branched into other aspects, economic analysis and so on. So we all do slightly different things, but I think your point about what the crisis has caused is that there has been a realization that we don't really have the, if I can put it this way, the luxury of sort of splitting hairs and being territorial and don't come on my turf, etc. I think people have realized that this is a time that all these associations have to deliver for their members. We have to give and add value to the members, without which you're not going to have these organizations. What is, of course, a little disheartening is that honestly, a lot of ship owners probably don't really know what we do in these associations, and time and again, new board members have come into ICS, have seen our agenda at a board meeting, and have been really surprised at the breadth and depth and scope of work in which we're involved. Of course, primarily at IMO. We have had observer status of IMO since 1961, and ICS actually was founded in 1921. So we are actually older than the IMO, and we're having our 100th anniversary this year. And so, but as back to the question of cooperation, we have cooperated very well. And the here and now issue, and the example I always use is crew change. When we began to realize as early as February of 2020 at ICS how serious this thing could become, we established a task force immediately, and we contacted all our fellow associate members, and in no time we had 50 or 60 people dialing in from all kinds of different parts of shipping to try and coordinate, to avoid duplication, to formulate a message that we could take to try and highlight the potential of how serious this problem could be. And I'm sorry to say that all this time later, yes, we have made some progress, but each time a new variant of this COVID has come about, it's set our work back again. But that is not to say that we won't make every conceivable effort to highlight that seafarers are key workers, just like they are in airline and other industries, and they must be treated as such.
But Esben, going back to the degree of, so you are all pursuing similar objectives. You're working on the industry as a whole, compared to, as you mentioned, Intercargo, Intertanko representing specific sectors, and BIMCO more on the documentary side. I understand that you all have the roundtable, you coordinate, you work together, and then you formulate common objectives that then you are putting in front of the IMO. How does it work?
Yeah, well, I mean, the other associations have their own representation at various levels of IMO as well. But what we try to do is within ICS, we try and formulate a position that all our member associations can sign up to. These other organizations have representation, as I say, at IMO, and very often will talk to a specific government about a specific issue. But we try and compare notes, and we try and wherever possible be aligned. We cannot be on every single issue, because there are some issues that are very specific, for example, to the container industry, that doesn't really apply to dry bulk or tank and so on. But we try on the, also on decarbonization, for example. This is, of course, in terms of long-term issues, the big one, the really big one. And there we try and work and compare notes, and our $5 billion fund that we're working so hard to try and get through at IMO. There's largely cross industries support for that, I'm happy to say.
How often does the roundtable get together?
Well, it varies a bit. The SecGens meet probably fairly regularly. I would guess probably, I don't really know for sure, but I think quarterly. And at chairman level, we meet once or twice a year, sort of, if possible, but it's a bit ad hoc.
So going now to the role that you all play in ICS in particular, vis-a-vis the regulatory and policy-making bodies. IMO is one, you have the European Union, you have other regulatory bodies. How are you working with all of them?
We, of course, IMO is the, I think is kind of the day-to-day. I would think we have people at IMO virtually every day that they're operating. Of course, we lost a lot last year because IMO were very reluctant to hold virtual meetings such as we're having now. They just didn't want to do it. So we lost a lot of time last year, but nonetheless, we as industry kept doing, the very, very best that we could. But at EU level, of course, we work very, very closely with EXA, because, of course, virtually, I think pretty well all members of EXA are also members of ICS. And so when we have an ICS board meeting, EXA, for example, will attend as observers, and so forth. And that's that is a good thing, because the EU, as you know, are growing very, very impatient and are pushing for quicker action, and we have to face the fact that some regional regulation, it's likely to happen, whether we like it or not, because whilst we all agree, everybody agrees that shipping is global, we have to accept that the world is changing, and that there is political pressure in many countries to move this agenda faster. So I think it would be probably a little naive to expect there will be no regional regulation, but so far as possible, if we can move in tandem with IMO and have the rules as global as possible, that of course is still the preference.
Yeah, I have a question on that coming down a bit later, but let me ask on the association landscape in general. We have, as we discussed, a number of well-established industry associations. We have ICS, we have BIMCO, Intertanko, Intercargo, the World Shipping Council, Intermanager. So you have a number of very well established and running organizations. And some of you, if not all of you, have status with the regulatory bodies. And now we see that there are other organizations outside of this landscape that have been formed. They are trying to promote industry issues. And clearly, these are well-meant initiatives, and no doubt they generate some benefits. On the other hand, shipping is already a fragmented industry at the ownership level. Aren't these new initiatives outside of these established organizations leading to more fragmentation as opposed to more cohesiveness and coordination of efforts?
I think certainly there is a potential for that to happen, but I think at the same time, sometimes you get a small NGO who will be, if I could say it honestly, very noisy and make a disproportionate impact through a headline that the press picks up because it's very grabbing. It's really interesting, and wow. And that's fine, because in some ways this keeps all of us on our toes. But an organization such as ICS, we are tasked with the much less glamorous work of, nitty-gritty, day in, day out meetings, meeting national governments at IMO, trying to explain the pragmatic side of shipping, what we're doing, the progress we're making, and so on. So I would call it quite unsexy, but nonetheless extremely important. And I am always heartened when I meet government people. They say, if we want an industry perspective, we like to come to ICS, and that frankly is music to my ears. But the fact that other NGOs and new organizations are started, of course, some would say, well, that is because you, ICS, and others have failed. I don't really see it that way. I think it's more that many people just don't know what we do. I didn't know what ICS did until I got involved, quite frankly. I mean, I got involved through the Singapore Shipping Association. I'm relatively new to association work, and by that I mean within the last 10, 12 years, I've been involved in association work. Until then, I didn't really know what happened. And so a lot of it, I think, is just simply based on not knowing, being unaware. And so maybe there is some failure on the part of not only ourselves, but other associations. But I think in all, to address this, one thing I felt very, very strongly about all these years is that we have to invest a lot more in communications, a lot more. I mean, until 2 years ago, 18 months, 2 years ago, in ICS, we didn't have a communication capability. We now have 2 persons full-time, plus an arrangement with a very, very good outside agency to try and address this very thing, because a lot of criticism of shipping is based on ignorance, and our role and the role of other associations is to explain and sort of persuade and cajole and showcase what it is that we do. The trouble is, positive news rarely sells newspapers, as they say. So this is a slight problem. No one is really that interested in the fact that the tanker industry has made incredible gains in these last 50 years. Unbelievable. But it doesn't really sell stories. So it's up to us to be much more proactive. And I think, if you take someone like Global Maritime Forum, I think, for example, they identified in one of their sessions the importance of this crew change issue. And we contacted them and we ended up cooperating with them because we were probably a good year ahead of them, if you like, in terms of nitty gritty. And that was absolutely fine. So several of their committee members worked with us and us with them. And I think it was a pretty good outcome.
And Esben, you're very right when you pointed out that I think shipping needs to enhance its public image. Here you have an industry that carries 90% of the global trade, but a lot of people are not aware of the role and importance of shipping. Usually you hear about shipping when you have an oil spill or something negative. You don't see a lot of promotion of the positive contribution of shipping to the everyday livelihood of the ordinary citizen. And now you have decisions being made by politicians who are under pressure from the broader public. So it is absolutely vital, and now with issues like decarbonization and so on, it's absolutely vital to enhance the communication aspect of shipping. And I'm glad you mentioned that. And I know ICS and other organizations are taking a lead, but this must be a consistent effort. It cannot be one-off or on occasion. Anyway.
No, I mean, Nicholas, to be fair, we've come from a very, very, very low base because traditionally shipping has been a sort of certainly out of sight, out of mind industry. And as you said earlier, in private hands and probably an industry perfectly happy to be operating under the radar. The fact of the matter is that with social media and the way the world is today and the demands, environmental demands in particular, you're kidding yourself if you think you can do that. So you may as well just face the fact that this is what you've got to do. And I'm sorry to be repetitious, but we have a good story to tell, largely, certainly some exceptions, but largely we have a great story to tell. And it is up to us to tell it. The day of the single purpose companies with managers hiding behind a Liberian company and not knowing who, or not being willing to disclose who the owners are, those days are thankfully long gone. And today everything is as it should be, very transparent and much, much improved.
Yeah, in another interview that I listened to, you mentioned about the corporatization of shipping, and that is indeed happening. And part of it is the increased transparency, obviously. We see shipping becoming publicly listed, attracting more attention. So clearly transparency and corporatization, I think, are happening today. But going back to a last question about ICS, would you like to share with us some, your experience with ICS and also some of the major objectives that you are working on today, and if there are any timetables for deliverables?
Well, I mean, what I've found in the ICS, like any good organization, hasn't evolved as circumstances require an organization to evolve. And one of the difficulties we've always had is that owners, once they understand what we do, they sort of will grudgingly agree to pay, but it's always via their own association. And so getting owners to pay is very, very difficult. Actually, owners, like all human beings, want something for nothing. It's just a common human trait. So what we decided to do is to stop banging this drum, because if people aren't willing or won't pay, then you have to think of plan B. And our plan B has simply been to be much more commercial in our approach to how we raise revenue. We've done extremely well on building our publications business. Very, 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 very well done. We've added, and we've done a number of other sort of commercial activities that are generating revenue, and they're therefore enabling us to grow the organization. In fact, we will grow by several more people this year in policy area and legal, where we are very, very stretched. as I say, nobody wants to pay, so it's up to us to figure it out. And I think we are beginning to figure it out. And of course, the more revenue we can raise, the more brains we can engage to serve our members, because that's obviously the point of the whole exercise is value to members. So I think this is on the ICS. We had a survey done by one of these R&D people to sort of look at our structure, to look at whether we're set up the right way, where we're doing our work the right way, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the comments I noticed that came back said, this is an organization with more brains per capita than one we've seen in a very long time. And that was, of course, nice to hear, because I think we do have some extremely competent people. As far as the issues are concerned, of course, I mentioned crew change. We have the big one is the environment. Obviously, we're working really hard to try and get this $5 billion R&D fund established, approved by IMO. It has proved more difficult than I would have liked and thought, but we have some pretty major countries behind it: Japan, Denmark, Singapore, Nigeria, Greece, and so forth. You know, we've got some big guns behind us. And I want to emphasize that we're not saying that this is a solution. We're saying it is it's a catalyst. It's part of a much, much bigger picture. You've got the Maersk Mc-Kinney Møller Center for zero carbon. You've got Singapore now set up a global hub for R&D as well. There's a lot of things going on around the world, and the more this can be coordinated, the better. But certainly, we just think that for industry to show at IMO that we are taking the initiative, we're not sitting waiting for countries to do it. We're doing it, and it's, to me, it's slightly ironic that then they try and put the brakes on it, because if we're trying to be proactive and help solve this problem, why would countries oppose it? But that's again, it's partly political. And then we've got numerous other issues. I mean, Gulf of Guinea is a huge one. The Strait of Hormuz, there's always some potential there. Competition. We've got umpteen issues, but certainly the here and now is crew change. Longer term is CO2 reduction environment.
Esben, I have two questions on that. And by the way, I appreciate you taking the time to discuss in depth. The point of these podcasts that we're hosting is not to have a quick run-of-the-mill type of thing, is to have the opportunity, the unique opportunity with people like yourself to go in depth, and that takes time. And thank you for sharing that with us. So I have two questions here. One question is on the regulatory side, and the other question is on decarbonization specifically. So on the regulatory side, clearly everybody, the whole industry would like the IMO to regulate, to come up with global regulations. But we see that the reality is, we see the EU coming up with their regulation. We hear noise that maybe China or the US may come up with their system. So can we still hope that there might be a global system? Or the reality is that inevitably we're going to a system of regional regulations? And then how do you coordinate? How do you avoid conflict? How do you monitor? How do you enforce? And that leads me to the second question. If you have a plurality of regulations, specifically on decarbonization, is the ship owner going to end up paying on multiple fronts?
That's a really tough one, Nicholas. It's very, very tough to really answer you correctly. Because in a way I would just be speculating, but I think the political reality is that we have to be prepared for, if we don't move fast enough, and if IMO doesn't move fast enough with the support of industry, we have to recognize that to put it in sort of an analogy, people will start taking the law into their own hands. I mean, I think this is entirely possible. I hope it doesn't happen. And I think if with really, hard work and good communications across these various, be it, the state of California, or be it China, be it the EU, with some goodwill and some cooperation and coordination, I think it is possible to avoid it. But I have to say, I'm not super optimistic when you look at it, because again, I meet ship owners who just cannot understand why everything takes so long at the IMO. I keep coming back to the Ballast Water Convention, 14 years in the making. You know, this is not how to do it. But the political aspect of all of this, this whole debate, the politics is increasing, and the pragmatists and the realists and so on are you know, they are not being heard in the way that one would like, which is all the more reason that we need as industry to coordinate and to make sure that we come up with a proper research and that we show what it is we're doing and what we see are the various ways ahead. I think it's very hard to predict. I wouldn't like to predict it, but I would say that I'm optimistic that with a bit of a tailwind and goodwill by all men or by all people, it could happen.
You know, you're very right, Esben, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, because you're right. I mean, there are so many parameters here, and you can't really forecast or you can't have a clear picture of how things will develop. But one thing that is very interesting is that from the shipping industry perspective, the role of the associations and the IMO is very clear, the path that you have to take. But on the other hand, now we have seen in reality that there are other policy-making bodies like the European Union, the European Parliament. So you have to have a voice there, and the presence and voice and the perception of the maritime industry in those regulatory bodies is not commensurate with obviously what is happening at the IMO and so on, that are very industry-specific associations.
No, I mean, if Nicholas, I've said this many times before, if you take ICAO and IATA, representing 290 airlines, I mean, they employ thousands of people and got budgets that, you know, there's mouth-watering, eye-watering. We are, ICS, for example, with a staff of 25, you know, it is really uphill, but it's really uphill. And I always plead with our members and owners to try and be more generous in supporting us, but we have to do the best with what we have, and we can do no more. But certainly the EU is pressing, because the electorate in the EU wants action. I think what people forget all the time is that the developing world have almost no voice in this. They are just sort of forgotten, and they're just going to have to kind of live with whatever is decided by the developing countries and developed countries. And I would urge the developed countries to be a bit more compassionate, if that's the right word, in dealing with the countries who can ill afford to, in many cases, feed their population, let alone engage in some of these very, very ambitious initiatives going forward.
One more question, if I can, on the humanitarian crisis and the crewing changes. Are we closer to a permanent solution or to a global solution?
We were making very good progress into Q3 and 4 in 2020, and even into the Q1 of this year. The problem has been these new strains that have come in. They're now named for things, but Delta or whatever. But you know, every time one of these new strains comes in, and there have been some cases, borders tend to become even more difficult than they were. And I think, you know, it's interesting, at ILO, International Labour Organization in Geneva, we've had Guy Ryder, their Director General, on. He tells us that in actual fact, shipping is the best industry to represent itself. We're the only industry with basically a global bill of rights for our employees, our seafarers, the only one on a global basis. And more than, I think it's close to 100 countries have signed up to the Maritime Labour Convention, which is very clear as to what the rights of these key workers, which seafarers are. They've signed up. And yet it's time and again, not in my backyard, sorry, you know, and then rules and regulations that make it basically impossible to change crew. So suddenly you get a territory that down comes the shutters, and that's it. And the ship may be on the way, or the ship will be there, and the crew is on the way, can't get in, and so on. I talked to quite a lot of ship managers about this, and the one thing is for the seafarers, but the people ashore planning these crew changes, it is just a nightmare, let alone the costs involved, because time and again, ship owners are having to charter planes. And that's 3-4 times the normal cost of what it would be to do a crew change. So it's really a problem. And we have pleaded, I even said this, I've said several times, we even had the Pope to address this issue. We've had it at UN General Assembly. It's been confirmed that the crew are indeed key workers. We've had transport ministers summits in London in July last year, and so on and so on. I and others, we've been on BBC, CNN. It's not as though this is new, but the problem is it appears to fall on deaf ears, and it's always not in my backyard.
The more we discuss, Esben, the more obvious it is, number one, the significance of the issues that you're tackling. And number two, the complexity and fluidity, I would say. And you are dealing with so many stakeholders over whom you have really no control. So we can all appreciate how difficult it is to drive consensus and enforcement and monitoring. So.
No, but certainly, you mentioned Intermanager and all the other associations on this particular issue. There's a lot of comparing of notes and a lot of cooperation, including with ITF, by the way. I mean, our relationship with ITF is certainly going through a very, very good phase, because again, we understand the problem and they are, I think, appreciative of the efforts we're making. But as a businessman, I have to say the bottom line is not that great. The result is not commensurate with the effort, I'm sad to say.
So moving on to a different topic, you have experienced the growth of Asia as a maritime power. And 1971, I think Hong Kong was the center. Since 1971, we have seen now Singapore becoming a dominant player in the region and in the global sphere. So now we have Singapore, we have Hong Kong, we have Shanghai. Can you share with us how you look at these three hubs today, their interconnection, their competitiveness, their role? And if I may also ask you, Singapore has kind of a niche of its own, but now we have seen Shanghai becoming a much more prevalent hub. So how does it work between Shanghai and Hong Kong looking ahead? If you can share with us how you see these three centers developing going ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You're absolutely right that when I got to Hong Kong, it was certainly the center, and it was building very, very quickly off the back of these so-called Shikumisan deals between Japanese trading houses, yards, Japanese charterers, and Hong Kong owners, typically financed in Hong Kong. This business model built the likes of Worldwide Shipping, as was before it became BW Group, Ferguson Worldwide, Hua Kwong, Vadis, TCC. Many of these names, really got their start doing this type of business, and then eventually diversified into similar structures with European counterparties. So I think by the peak of the early mid 80s, or I say early 80s, before the market took a real downturn, the fleet of Hong Kong was probably approaching 70 million tons deadweight. I mean, it was just massive, and sadly many one dealt with in those days as a broker are no longer there. So Hong Kong, I think Hong Kong in the run-up to 1997, of course, quite a number of owners decamped and set up offices in places like Vancouver, and very often with back offices there, but with what we call hearts and minds control back in Hong Kong. So there was there was definitely a reduction in the run-up to 1997. Then post-97, when it all turned out to be not such a big event, there was some growth again, and of course the growth since then has probably been private Chinese PRC shipping companies, which were non-existent, by the way, until well into the 80s or even 90s, I think. They didn't exist, but that's sort of a growth business for Hong Kong today, more than you could say, the so-called domestic Hong Kong owners. So Hong Kong is still very much a center, legal and arbitration, and certainly a long and strong history. It's very much still there. Shanghai, of course, has grown tremendously over the years, and no doubt will continue to do so. So in a way, you could say there's kind of maybe a bit of a healthy competition between Hong Kong and Shanghai. They are, after all, both part of the greater China. But with Hong Kong, I think Hong Kong is putting a lot of emphasis on what they call the Greater Bay Area, which is Macau, Zhuhai, Guangzhou, and this whole southern Chinese area, which of course is a massive population and a massive market and a very prosperous part of China. In the case of Singapore, when I worked in Singapore in 1974 for about 7 or 8 months, when the chartering manager at the time was on leave. In those days, you had 6 months leave after 2.5 years, which is quite normal. So a hangover from the days of when you had to go return by sea. And that of course, that process came to an end shortly after, but it was just the tail end of it. So he went off, and I was transferred to Singapore from Hong Kong to stand in for him. And at that time, Singapore was a small, very regional Southeast Asia sort of hub. It was typically, trading to Indonesia, Thailand, and India. It was just very regional. It was not global. Then in the late 80s, the Singapore government developed a strategy whereby they wanted to build an international maritime center, and they reorganized the whole way they did it, taxation system and so forth, and with a real effort to get international ship owners to come on shore. And particularly, you could say from about 2000 or early 2000 onwards, this has been spectacularly successful with, I think it's approaching 60 international ship owners, if not more, with fairly major presence in Singapore. So that has been a very, very great success story, even if the domestic owning base is not as significant as, for example, Hong Kong. But nonetheless, Singapore is also very, very big for traders, and a tremendous number of traders have got big presences in Singapore, and that of course gives rise to chartering business, and that's good for local brokers, both to fix ships for European and other owners controlled in Singapore and elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Esben. That's a complicated question. I mean, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if I were a ship owner myself and I wanted to open an office in Asia, I don't know where I would go. I'm not going to ask you the question because I don't want you to take sides. But going to the next one, you mentioned that looking ahead, you expect massive changes for global shipping as the result of new fuel types and their infrastructure, new technology and regulatory requirements. Can you share with us which changes you see coming through and what you anticipate?
Yeah,
and also how this will affect the small, medium ship owner who has been the backbone of shipping so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the last part of your question comment is absolutely correct. We were looking at it recently and find that about just over 30% of the world fleet is what you would call controlled by what you would call SME, and for want of a small medium enterprise, for want of a definition, i.e. 5 to 20 ships. So 1/3 of the world fleet, which is highly significant, obviously. And many of these companies are highly entrepreneurial and very quick on their feet and very flexible, and they very often have the, in my opinion, major advantage of being able to make quick decisions. The one thing is, once you get big and corporate, the larger you get, the more corporate you get, unless you're extremely clever, the more complex the decision-making process gets. And very often in shipping, You may be making a very, very big investment based on, this and this. I mean, and that still goes on to this day. And as a private SME, you can do that. But there's no doubt that there is a certain trend towards corporatization and size. You look at the container industry, a tremendous amount of consolidation in recent years. Even the tanker industry has consolidated quite a lot, even though it's still a very long way to go. And the dry bulk, I think it's that's just, I'm not sure it's ever going to happen, because it's such a huge fleet, and there are just so many players in it. But I think that there's no doubt that the bigger companies have more resources to devote to studying new fuel types and new systems and so forth. There's no question about that. And there's always a high price for being a first mover, but at the same time, information is quite readily available, and it may well be that some of these quick and astute owners they may not be first movers, but they will. If you're clever and a little bit lucky, you try and spot what is the trend going to be, which way is this going, whether it's hydrogen or ammonia or battery or whatever, which one is going to be. But the fact of the matter is that we're still quite a long way away from it, and without wanting to overdo it, this R&D fund that we're trying to promote is important, because we just have to spend the money and try and understand and learn how it is that we can produce these fuels on a scale that the industry needs. At the moment, there are lots of experiments going on, small ships going across a harbor or a bay on battery power. It's great, but how do you scale that up? I mean, that is really the issue. You take ammonia. If you triple current ammonia production, 750 gigawatts, shipping would use more than 60% of that production.
Wow.
The numbers are just massive, and so I think there's so much going on at the moment in terms of experimentation and R&D across so many, whether it's the engine manufacturers or the R&D facilities or owners themselves, because whoever works this out, there's a certain competitiveness to it, and that's a good thing, because whoever works this out, it may have a first mover advantage. I think we call it the fourth propulsive revolution in the ICS. It is going to be a revolution, clearly, and many people think it will be a mixture of fuel types, that there isn't one that will fit all. The interim is clearly dual fuel. LNG is interim, I think, as well, as we've seen. I think 25-30% of the order book is now dual fuel. So again, that's quite a quick development. If you mentioned dual fuel even 2-3 years ago, it was sort of quite a new thing. So I think all this moves. I think this moves quicker than many people really sort of acknowledge. And as I've said many times before, I'm quite optimistic about this.
Thank you.
That we'll get there.
Now, we have been discussing for over an hour, so we're coming closer to the conclusion of our discussion. I have just 3 quick questions for you, but important ones. You are obviously a citizen of the world, and you are in an industry, shipping, that is 24/7. As long as I know you, Esben, I have seen you travel all over the place. Even the global pandemic has not been able to stop you. It slowed you down in terms of traveling, but you're still traveling. So, and I read in your book how when you took over as president of the Singapore Shipping Association and ICS, you made it a point to travel and meet your members all over the world. So how do you manage to really do this and also combine personal life, business life?
Well, as I said to you before we sort of got going up officially, I work for the Enesel family. And they have been tremendously supportive to allow me, if you like, even though I'm employed by them, and I have been for 11 years, they allow me and encourage me to do this work. if I didn't have the support from them, I'm not sure that I would be able to do it, because I think most employers would say, what the hell are you doing? This is our time. You're zapping around the world, meeting shipowner associations. So it might not, but anyway, they have been supportive, and that is a very, very key factor. And I think the other boards that I've been involved with they're very diverse in very, I've been involved in tankers and ro-ro and dry bulk, in marine insurance, and so forth. So I'm involved in different things, and I find it extremely interesting, and it's nice to always be learning. And because I basically live alone, I have family, but I live alone, and so my spare time very often is taken up by work. As far as travel is concerned, well, I was in Singapore actually from last when it was for about 9 months without travel, which for me was pretty unusual. But this summer I'm in Europe, and I am traveling around again, although it's a lot more complicated to travel, as you know, than it used to be.
Indeed. But now one more question along the same line about your book. Frankly, I love the book, not only because of the content, the way you work. I mean, you have a great ability to write. So how did you find the time for that? I mean, that was a massive undertaking, keeping all those facts, getting all those pictures in place. Have you been working on that book for a long time? I mean, what gave you the idea of doing it?
It took me about 20 months. And during that time, it was a lot of weekends, or particularly evenings, a lot, I have to admit. But I had an editor to help me, and I might tell you that the text I submitted to her was about twice as long as the one you read. So it was very, very long, in fact, far too long. And part of her job was to, I used to say to her, please be brutal. And she was. And so we got it down to, I think, a manageable size. It's probably still a bit long, but nonetheless, but as far as the idea of doing it was, well, I tried to get my parents to do something similar, and they just could never be bothered. And we have some tapes of, various interesting periods throughout their history. And but my daughters have encouraged me to, over the years, to also do it. And then I don't know, one day I just sat down and said, okay, I'm going to start right now. And I laid out a plan. I do have a lot of pictures, huge number of pictures that these days, of course, you can scan them into very high quality. So yeah.
But the way I'd like to remind everyone listening to us that the proceeds of the book go to the Mission of Seafarers, of which you are a vice president. And if anyone would like to buy the book, and I urge you to do so, please reach out to us at webinars@capitallink.com, and we'll give you the instructions how to proceed. So we are almost at the end. Esben, you've built a tremendous career. Reflecting back, anything you would have done differently? Any advice you would give to a younger self of yours before going to Hong Kong in 1971?
No, I actually don't think so. When I went to Hong Kong in 1971, people that I went to university and school with in Vancouver thought I was absolutely out of my mind, because it was just at that time not the done thing. And I have absolutely no regrets. I consider myself incredibly lucky in what I've managed to experience throughout all these many years. And yes, as I said before, the people I've met, it's one thing about the ICS job. Some of the people I've met, I mean, it's just been absolutely fascinating. And there is actually a book 2 coming out next year. It will finish at the end of June next year when I step down from ICF. That's it. The chapter will finish. But I have quite a few interesting, well, to me anyway, interesting stories in there. So I'm going to do it. It will come out sometime after June.
We look forward to it. I mean, your book was so fact-filled and with people that are very well known in the industry. So it was a delight reading. And now I know you, concluding question, I know you're doing so many things. Your agenda is full of interesting and a lot of things, but anything new or what's next in your agenda?
Well, I'm working on a couple of things with which I can't speak about openly because it's still a work in progress. But it is to do with ships of the future, environment, and new propulsion systems. And so I'm just lending my name and whatever expertise I may have to it. And if we could pull that off, it would be great. But it would be tempting fate to say too much about it now. And there are one or two other advisory and board possibilities that is being discussed. But of course, my age is 72, and so I don't really have, in terms of those numbers, I don't have that much of a runway. But I'll try and make the most of that runway while there's still a bit left in it.
Well, Esben, what can I say? Thank you very much for spending all this time with us for this amazingly insightful discussion. Concluding our podcast, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank you also for the great relationship we have developed and your contribution to the industry. And I would like to also thank the UK P&I Club for sponsoring today's podcast. So thank you, Esben.
Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Thanks. All the best. Thanks.